Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today we're, of course, debating the new NAFTA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA here in this country at least. The original NAFTA was signed in 1994 by the Liberals. It was negotiated by the Conservatives. And it had promises of more jobs and secure access to the largest markets in the world. And, you know, supporters of that agreement will point out that Canada's GDP and cross-border trade have grown since then, since that agreement was signed. But those benefits have really bypassed many Canadian workers. In that time, Canada lost 400,000 manufacturing jobs. Its textile industry was devastated. And that's because this agreement had allowed those jobs to migrate to areas such as Mexico, the southern U.S., where there was lower labor costs, and Canada just lost out. Now, the wealth inequality in Canada grew because the GDP benefits that trade engendered went largely to shareholders and corporations instead of the workers. You look at any graph comparing GDP to what, you know, the real wages of Canadians are, and the wages flatline while GDP goes up. So, you know, the NDP has always supported fair trade, but in many of our free trade agreements, there are many provisions, many clauses that are anything but fair. One of them in this, the original NAFTA, was the proportionality clause that gave the United States the right to demand a constant proportion, for instance, of our oil and gas shipments. If we produced oil and gas and the Americans were getting 60% of it, we had to make sure they got 60%, even if we doubled our output, or even if our output came down by half. The United States could keep that proportion, even if we felt it was in our interests to keep it to ourselves. Another flaw in many of our trade agreements, not just NAFTA, but with the Trans-Pacific Partnership with China, is the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, the ISDS. In NAFTA was Chapter 11. And that, as many people will know, allowed corporations to sue the government in Canada if they felt that the government had made changes to regulations that affected their profitability. Even if Canada was doing that as a way of protecting our environment, protecting the health of Canadians, the American corporations could sue Canadian governments to reverse those changes. And one of the most egregious examples of this, and I know the member from Saanich Gulf Islands mentioned it in her speech, or a member from Elmwood Transcona in his, and so I would just like to say this again. In 1997, shortly after NAFTA was signed, Ethel Corporation, an American corporation, had made a gasoline additive called MMT. Now, Canada was concerned because MMT was a suspected neurotoxin. They were worried about the effects it had on people. Car manufacturers didn't like it because it gummed up the onboard diagnostics in cars, so Canada banned it. Ethel Corporation sued Canada and won in one of the secret tribunals, NAFTA tribunals associated with Chapter 11 disputes. And Canada was forced not only to pay Ethel Corporation $19.5 million in damages, but it had to reverse those regulatory changes. So now we had to allow the use of MMT in Canada. And third, we had to get on our knees and apologize to Ethel Corporation for doing that. And here we were trying to assert our sovereignty over the health of our people, over the health of our environment. And Canada has been faced with many of these challenges through NAFTA, far more than the United States or Mexico. And it's just an example of when you go into these so-called free trade agreements, you are often giving up your sovereignty. And this new agreement is better in two ways. One is that Chapter 11 is gone, thank goodness. The NDP is very happy about that. We wish we could get rid of it in the agreements that we had in the CPTPP, with our agreements with China. It's a little better in CETA, thanks to the actions of Germany that softened those provisions. But we're very happy, the NDP is very happy that Chapter 11 is gone, and we're happy that the proportionality clause is gone. So two good things I'll put right out there that we like about this new agreement. So on to the things that maybe aren't so good. For one thing, it extends drug patent protection in Canada from 8 years to 10 years. That adds 2 years onto the time when Canadians have to pay the drug companies that develop drugs full price for those drugs. The Canadian drug companies were doing fine with the 8 years, and we were getting the benefits. After 8 years, we could use generic substitutes for those drugs. It brought our drug prices down quite a bit, and we're still paying some of the highest drug prices in the world. But now we're going to have to do that, pay those very high prices for another 2 years, and the Parliamentary Budget Office came out with a cost to Canadians of $169 million every year that Canada will have to pay drug companies because of that provision. This agreement also gives away more of our dairy market to foreign suppliers. And that factor is exacerbated by the fact that we've already done that in our agreements with the European Union and with the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries. And we now are opened up our dairy market by 10%. This agreement is for 3.6%. It also allows American companies and the dairy products that we're getting from the States. For instance, I hear concerns from my constituents. Those dairy producers are allowed to use bovine growth hormone, something that boosts the milk production in cows, but it has unknown effects in humans, and it has some serious effects on the health of the cows themselves. So people are very concerned that we are degrading our products that we are now forced to use. And I recently talked with a dairy producer in British Columbia. His company produces milk products, milk protein type products. And this is another example of giving away our sovereignty. The United States now has the ability to control not only how much of our products such as those go to the United States, but how much is that we export anywhere in the world. So the United States has a say over that. Now, I just want to cover a couple of points of trade that are very concerning in my riding that aren't covered in this deal. One is the softwood lumber dispute, not covered at all. Very happy to hear that the U.S. Commerce Department has decided to lower the tariffs, the illegal tariffs that we've been suffering through just recently, but we're anxiously awaiting the end to that almost unending dispute. Another is with the wine producers in my riding in the Okanagan Valley that produces the finest wine in Canada. Other countries are concerned, the United States, Australia, are concerned with some of we have given our wine producers, they don't have to pay the excise tax. If they're producing wine from Canadian grapes, they don't have to pay the excise tax to the federal government. And that has really driven the growth in our wine industry. It's been a huge benefit. And now we're being battled on the international trade market especially we have an automatic escalator in that excise tax, and the finance minister tells me they're not really willing to negotiate. So I'll just finish there. Mr. Speaker, I'll say that the NDP is looking forward to debating this in committee, and we want to see if this agreement is a better deal, because that's the big question here. Is this a better deal than the old NAFTA? Thank you.